Hello, everyone, and welcome to the July broadcast of RELO Andy's webinars. For those of you not familiar with the RELO office, the RELO is the Regional English Language Office, and we are coming to you from the U.S. Embassy in Lima, Peru. My name is Maggie Steingraber. I am an English language fellow who is based here in Lima. I host and coordinate the webinars, so any questions or feedback you have from the webinars, my contact is in the email that you received. Please feel free to write to me. I just want to take a quick poll to ask you, how many languages do you speak? All right, and I'll show the results. 58% of you speak 2 languages, 36% of you speak 3, and 6% of you speak 4. So we have a lot of multilingual people who are joining us today. So with that, we will begin today's presentation. Our speaker today is Vanessa Mari. She is an English language fellow who is also based in Lima, Peru. She is seated right next to me. Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Maggie.
Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what you're going to talk about today?
Yes, of course. Well, my name is Vanessa Mari, and I am an English language fellow here in Lima. I have been working in Lima for 10 months now, and after this, I'm going to be a professor at the university at Nevada State College. And I'm really looking forward to talking to you about translanguaging. I know this is a very new term that is used in academia and even in the classroom, so I'm looking forward to discussing this topic with you and to hearing your thoughts and opinions.
Great. You can begin when you're ready.
Okay, so the topic for today is Introduction to Translanguaging in the ESL and EFL classroom. And the objectives that I have for today is that I want us all to discuss what translanguaging is and the role that it has in our classroom. And we're also going to evaluate examples of translanguaging. So translanguaging is something that is happening in every ESL and EFL classroom, especially for all of us that are bilingual speakers and trilingual. And I'm very happy to see that a lot of you are bilingual and multilingual. So the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to have a fun fact poll. And it is a question that's asking how many languages are there in the world? And I'd like to see what people respond to this question, because it's going to give you an idea of the diversity that there are in languages and why translanguaging is happening.
So 37% of you voted for 6,000 to 7,000, 50% said 2,000 to 3,000. 5% said 500 to 1,000, 8% said 50 to 100.
Okay, great. Thank you for the information. So the correct answer for this one is actually A. There's 6,000 languages, around 7,000. It's very hard to have one specific number for how many languages there are, because many of them are endangered languages. But this huge number is just showing you the language diversity that we have. And even here in South America, we have a lot of languages, and we're going to talk a little bit about that later. So as the presentation is going, I really want you to reflect on these questions. I want you to reflect about and think about the language that you use in the classroom as a teacher, and also how much Spanish do you use, and when do you use Spanish? Do you see yourself using Spanish in specific instances, or do you use it sparingly? And just another fun fact, there are 47 indigenous languages in Peru. So we're seeing that in the case of Peru, there is a lot of linguistic diversity. So sometimes when we're teaching English, we have a lot of students that are actually trilingual. They might know Spanish, Quechua, plus additionally they're learning English. And out of the 20 million population, 4 million speakers, at least in Peru, are speakers of native languages, of indigenous languages. So I have another poll here for you, which is how much Spanish do you use in your class? And it's a lot of percentages. So I want you to pick and be honest on this one. There's no right or wrong answer.
Share the results. We have 14% said 80 to 90%, 11% said 60 to 70%, 61% said 40 to 50%, and 14% said never.
Okay, great. Thank you for sharing these results. So as we can see here, some of you said that you never do it, and most of you do acknowledge that Spanish does play a role in your classroom, and even when you are just teaching English. And I know that this really has to do with the level of proficiency that our students have, and we're gonna start discussing this specifically. So the last thing that we're going to do before I delve into the topic of translanguaging is that I want you to describe what it means to be bilingual with just 2 words.
Different worlds, says Roberto. 2 languages from Gaudi. Victor Hugo says communicate, networking. Globally communicate from Maribel. New cultures, Claudia. Juan Carlos says 2 languages. April, languages management. 2 languages, Fanny. A lot of people say 2 languages. Global communication.
Okay, good. Thank you. I really like that you're, a lot of you mentioned the word culture, even it's saying words like 2 worlds, because one of the things that we are learning and we're doing when we're teaching a language is we're also teaching culture. With language, there's a lot of underlying layers that us as teachers are teaching our students as well. So it's just not teaching English, it's also teaching a different culture and a different way of thinking. So on this next slide, what you see are some pictures that I think sometimes represent some classrooms where we say it's the English only zone, English only, don't talk any with Spanish. And there's a quote by Swain that as a teacher really inspires me, and it says bilingualism through monolingualism. And what this means for me is that we want our students to be bilingual in 2 languages, but we want to achieve this by having a monolingual pedagogy where English is the only language that you can use in the classroom. And bilingualism is, some people define it as 2 monolinguals in 1. Right? And this can also be a very challenging notion because it's very hard to be a balanced bilingual. I myself, my native language is Spanish, but I don't consider myself a balanced bilingual because there are certain things that I am stronger in. I'm a stronger writer in English, but I speak Spanish better, I would say. So bilingualism, this notion of being 2 monolinguals in 1, sometimes also plays a role in the way that we teach, where we are expecting our students to be monolingual, basically have this native speaker knowledge of the language. So what exactly is translanguaging? We've taken a couple polls, you've heard me talk about it, but a concise definition of this. Garcia defines translanguaging as the language practice of bilinguals and the multiple discursive practices in which bilinguals engage in order to make sense of their bilingual worlds. So what we see here is this word, multiple discursive practices. What this means is what languages are they using in order to make sense of something, of what they're learning. So they could be using multiple languages in order to learn a concept in English. And translanguaging is also the act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of what are described as autonomous languages in order to maximize communicative potential. So here, this last few words, maximize communicative potential, are very important because the reason that we are doing translanguaging naturally is to communicate better with others and to learn more about the subject matter. And there's other researchers too that are talking about flexible bilingual practices. And the flexible bilingual practices in the classroom is that allows for learners to emerge as bilinguals, able to articulate knowledge while focusing on the concept and not only on their use of one language or the other. So this specific research is looking at the context of Puerto Rico, which is a Latin American speaking space. So here specifically, they were looking at how in some colleges and universities, the textbooks are in English, but the class is in Spanish. And this is something that is very common in Latin America, where we are using English text, but we are talking in Spanish. So they're seeing how being able to translanguage in the classroom, what they're doing is that they are focusing on the concept instead of just the language that they're using. So they're learning more about that concept. And some of the benefits, the pedagogical potential benefits of this for teachers, that is increasing the inclusion and the participation and understanding of pupils in the learning process. So sometimes when we tell students you can't speak in Spanish, you can't do that like it's banned from the classroom, then it's not doing this. You know, you need to increase the inclusion. Even if the response that they're giving you is in Spanish, they're still participating and they're actively learning. And it's also developing less formal relationships between participants. And it's conveying more ideas easily and accomplishing lessons, which is what is very important. We have, as a teacher, as an ESL teacher or EFL teacher, we need to accomplish lessons and convey these ideas more easily. And sometimes by using both languages in the classroom, this can be achieved more effectively. So why translanguaging? Okay, so translanguaging promotes a deeper and fuller understanding of the subject matter. It also helps the development of the weaker language. Okay, and it facilitates the home and the school links, which is very important as well. You know, sometimes our students don't see a connection between Spanish or the language spoken at home and the language spoken at school. So what translanguaging is doing when we're doing this is that it's helping bridge that gap. And it's also promoting a deeper and fuller understanding of what we are teaching. So this code is a little long, but I want us to dissect it together. And what it says is, it is possible in a monolingual teaching situation for a student to answer questions or write an essay about a subject without fully understanding it. You know, this reminds me when sometimes teachers write on the board, and they fill the board, and the students are copying from the board. This process of copying from the board is not cognitively demanding. It's very cognitively undemanding, which means that the student is not going through a process of actually learning or retaining this information. And it says processing for meaning may not have occurred when we're doing things like this. So whole sentences or paragraphs can be copied without real understanding. It is less easy to do this with translanguaging. Okay, so to read and discuss a topic in one language and then to write about it in another language means that the subject matter has to be processed and digested. So I want you to think about this. You know, if a student reads about a topic in Spanish, but then has to write in English, there's this process that is being digested that is more cognitively demanding for the students and that they're going to learn more. But then I want you to think about how often do you include Spanish in your lesson, okay? So do you give students stories in Spanish, but the work has to be in English, or vice versa? Or do they hear recordings in Spanish, but they have to respond in English, etc.? So the first excerpt that I have here, these are teachers' voices, and we're actually going to play a short clip that is an example of a teacher in New York, and he's talking about the way that he uses translanguaging. So we're going to watch that short clip, and then I'll talk about this.
Up on the board, I have, I wasn't sure if that was correct. Sharon helped me with that yesterday. Sharon, what does number 1 say on remember? Trabajando al revés. Correct? Work backwards? Does everyone agree with that? The lesson that followed it, I try and make sure whatever the word problem is, I have to adapt it for the Spanish speakers and the Polish speakers, because some of the language in the problem that's written in English, it's harder for them to understand. Even for the kids who only speak English, the problem is just as difficult for them as well. So the translanguaging really helps them not only get motivated, but also to understand the concept behind the problem. Hay dos problemas, ¿sí? Okay, the first one, Oscar, could you read your problem? Wait, louder, slower. Go ahead. I like to put the kids' names in the problem, so I'll change that around. But you know, when you are translanguaging, it's good to save everything, so you don't have to do everything over and over again. So that helps too. Tiff, do you want to give it a shot, or you want to try it? Okay. Now, Tiffany's mom.
Okay, so if you notice here on the video, the instructions are up on the board, and the teacher is using both Spanish and English. So for example, it says trabajando al revés, working backwards. It also says find a denominador
now,
común,
did that make
right?
sense
So
to
this
you,
is
some
a
of it?
math
Some of it, okay.
class. So he's saying
since I don't speak
denominador
Polish,
común,
Matthew
find a
usually
denominador
helps
común. So
me
you see
with
English and
the,
Spanish
what do
there.
you call that thing?
And then regroup and
iPad.
simplify
Okay, yeah,
and
translate,
explain.
okay? Thank you, good try. 8 por 2 es 16, entonces 5 por 2, 10. Joan, tienes 1 y 10 16? There were two problems. They had to, it's a strategy that we have in Go Math called working backwards, where basically, it's almost like an algebra problem where if I said, a basic example would be like 5 plus 3 plus x equals 10. So it's 5 plus 3 is 8, plus x would be 2 equals 10. But this is with mixed numbers. So it's much more difficult, and they basically had to take two fractions, mixed numbers, with unlike denominators, add them, find a common denominator, simplify it, and then subtract it from another mixed number, which is a lot even for a student who is English proficient. Ice sculpture, I forgot how to say it again. Melissa, how do you say it? How do you say ice sculpture again? I want to not look at it. Escultura de hielo. Remember, when you're making your own problem with your partner, remember, you want to make it so they already give you the total of something and you have to find the missing piece. Okay, so you're working what? Backwards. Okay, just keep that in mind, okay?
Okay, so as we can see on that video, the teacher is using more than one language. He's speaking in English, he's using Spanish, and he's also using a little bit of Polish. So on this PowerPoint, if you download it, you'll be able to see the rest of the video because the lesson keeps going on, and it gives a really good example of how this teacher is able to do it. So what I'm going to show you now are some experts of interviews that I did to Puerto Rican teachers. So these were all English teachers in Puerto Rico, and when I was talking to them about Spanish and English use in their classroom, there were a couple of quotes that really stood out to me that I wanted to share with you. So this is a public school teacher from secondary school, and what she said about her students is that ellos le tienen terror a escribir. So the students are very, very afraid of writing. It's something that they are terrified to do. Yo les digo que escriban en Spanish, solamente escriban. Una cosa que me gusta dar es citado porque yo les cito un párrafo y ellos escriben. So this teacher is focusing on wanting the students to write, and what she's saying is, I just tell them to write, even though it's in Spanish, it's getting them to write about the topic, and they're eventually going to learn the language. And she also does dictados and activities where they are listening to her speaking English, and then they're writing it. Because since they're very intimidated to produce their own writing in English. Another teacher said that the students, they turn in the Spanish version, but also turn in the semi-translated version into English. So we can see how this teacher is letting the students turn in their work a Spanish version because they feel more comfortable writing in Spanish and they are more dominant in that language, but they're also turning in a semi-translated version into English. So this process of writing in Spanish and then translating it into English is enabling the students to learn the language, and they're also learning a lot more about the content. And then the teacher says, but that's something I have to ask them constantly. I have to ask them to produce in English. And I know it is because they compare themselves with the teacher and are worried about accents. So I think this is a very common situation that we have in Latin America, where our students are very worried about accents or compare themselves to the teacher. So a way that this teacher was able to help the students was by letting them write how they felt more comfortable, and then using English in their writing. So another example, this teacher says, I always encourage them to work. She always encourages her students to work. And she tells them, if you don't know English, then just do it in Spanglish. They will learn eventually, and they do. So I just tell them to write about what's in their head, and they like that. So what I really like about this quote is that the teacher's acknowledging, write about what's in your head. And the reality with our students is that what's in their head is more than one language. They might be stronger in Spanish, and she acknowledges this. She acknowledges and she tells them, Write me an essay, write me a sentence, write me a paragraph, whatever you feel more comfortable in Spanglish. Use both languages, and then we will work together to make it a one piece just in English. So there's a couple of benefits of translanguaging in the classroom. We have one more video with the same teacher that I'm going to play, and he's talking about what benefits he sees in his classroom when he does this.
Well, I would, first of all, tell the kids not to be afraid to write in their own language. I mean, I would tell them, if you know how to say something in, in Japanese, say it in Japanese. If you don't know how to say it in English, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. And I would tell them there's nothing wrong with writing it as well. If you know how to write something in Albanian and not English, write that. There's nothing wrong with that. You're still getting your point across. Someone will still understand that. Well, I think when things are translanguage, when lessons are translanguage, when essential questions are translanguage, they're able to see what they already know in their language and how it's written in the language they're supposed to learn. So I find that there are a lot of students who don't use the translanguaging as a way to continue to speak and write in their own language. Some do, but I find over the years, more of them, it motivates them to learn English and to learn how to say different things in English, and that helps them in their reading and their writing and their math and all their subjects. Some advice I would give for teachers who are interested in translanguaging, I would say to not be afraid of it, to embrace it, because you might find teachers in your school are already doing it. You might find some resistance to it, but I think if you are an ESL teacher or you're not but have ESL students in your room, I think it's a great motivational tool. And the kids want to help. You might not think that they want to, but when you ask a student who speaks Russian, how do you say this word in Russian? And if they know it, I've found in my own experience, they're more than happy to tell you. It makes the classroom more inviting. If you find yourself in a situation where you're thinking about becoming an ESL teacher, or I know some teachers have situations where they're not an ESL teacher, but they do have ESL students in their class, I say just embrace it and ask for help. There's so many resources out there, and there's so many people who are willing to help, and the best resource that I can say is the kids, without a doubt.
Okay, so on that video, he mentions that there's a lot of resources out there. I'm going, if you have a question, send me an email and I will be sending you those. And I'm going to show you my email at the end. So I also want you to think about this. If you have students that have a low proficiency of English, have you considered maybe giving them a short story in Spanish and then having them discuss that short story in English? Or using that short story in Spanish in the classroom and then you helping them understand what it means in English. Okay, so it's about using all of the linguistic repertoire that our students have, all of that they know, the languages that they know, to be able to teach the other one. So some of the benefits of being able to do this is the ability to engage audience through translanguaging. So our students are going to be engaged when you're using both languages and where they can actually understand what's going on in the classroom. Also, using the students' translanguages to establish an identity position, and the recognition that languages do not veer into clear bounded entities, and that all languages are needed for meaning to be conveyed and negotiated. And I think this is something that we really need to recognize. We need to recognize that Spanish and English, when we're bilingual, these languages are, can be mixed. It's not like one language and there's a border between these, right? So they're not clear bounded identities, they're together. And we need to use these languages for meaning to be conveyed. That's why you see a lot of Spanglish being used and a mixing of more than one language. Also, the endorsement of simultaneous literacies and languages to keep the pedagogic task moving, which is very important, not to get stuck in one specific place because the students don't understand what's going on. You know, you use the simultaneous literacies to keep the task going. And also the recognition that teachers and students skillfully use their languages for different functional goals, such as narration and explanation. Okay, so being able to use both languages for this. And also for using Translanguages for annotating text, providing greater access to the curriculum and lesson accomplishments. So the text, like I said, can be in Spanish, but the writing is in English, or vice versa, or listening to a recording in English and responding to that recording in Spanish. So as the last thing that I want us to do is to reflect on this at the end, you know, because we're reaching the end of the presentation, is how do you see translanguaging practices playing a role in your classroom? How do you see you yourself using Spanish or your students using Spanish and using English simultaneously? How do you see these practices playing a role in your classroom? This is a topic that I'm very interested in, and if you would like to share your story and your experiences with translanguaging, please write to me an email at vanessa.mari22@gmail.com. If you have any questions or if you would like more resources and articles and examples, I can definitely send them to you if you send me an email. So I really look forward to hearing your questions.
All right, thank you, Vanessa. One question came in throughout the presentation from Heidi. And that was, what if a student uses a word in his native language because he doesn't know the equivalent in the second language or can't explain it?
You know, that's something that happens very commonly. You know, I'm a native speaker of Spanish as well, and I want to say a word that I know in Spanish, but there is no equivalent in English, and that's going to happen. You know, there's going to be words that are just not translatable from one language to another.
One other question came up from Marcella. Her question was, how would you respond to a lot of the EFL teachers who say that only to use English in the English classroom?
Yeah, well, I think one of the things that happens is that we are told that we can't use Spanish at all. And what I would tell an EFL or a teacher is to give this a try and see if it has see how it goes. Okay, so have one group of students that she doesn't use any translanguaging with, and then another group of students that she does, and then see how the growth that's going on in these classrooms, and see what the attitudes that the students have about English. Does it change by one classroom or the other? And more often than not, the attitudes are more positive when they're seeing translanguaging practices with the English classroom.
Victor Hugo had a question. Is it possible to ask students to find the main idea of a text or to infer or make an oral presentation without translanguaging?
Well, you know, I think it's possible for you to do it. Of course, it is possible. I think if you're asking students to talk in front of the classroom and they have the proficiency and they feel comfortable to do this just in English, then go right ahead and do it. But if the student doesn't have that proficiency or doesn't feel comfortable speaking English in the classroom, sometimes just forcing them to do it might give them a negative attitude towards the teacher and the language.
It just went away. There was a question on Maribel wanted to know if you have any books that you could recommend about the topic.
Okay, so books for students, there are a lot of books. Out of my head, I mean, if you write me an email, I can send you the titles of these texts, but there are already literature out there and short stories for students that are written in Spanish and English. And what I mean by this is that they're simultaneous. It's not that there's a Spanish version, there's an English version. It's that through the text, both languages are present. So using text like this, looking up on the internet, even going on Google, you can put short story with translanguaging. You're going to find information about this.
Roberto had a question on what linguistic area do you think gets most benefited by using translanguaging in the classroom?
It really depends on what you as a teacher do. If you want to focus on reading, then that's the area that's going to increase. But using translanguaging, I really think it helps with the 4 areas.
Anna Maria wanted to know, can we present a text in English and Spanish to our students?
Yes, of course. I think you should definitely look for a text in using either both languages or just using English or Spanish, and then making a decision about this. I think one of the things that I guess asked the most is, and that's why I asked the question about percentages, is that a lot of teachers, when I've talked about them, when I've talked about this topic, they think it's they're under this impression that they can never do it, but the reality is that they do it. Their students do it. So it's better to accept the reality of what's going on in the classroom than to try to change it and going against the current.
Abril wants to know, if learners are in an advanced language level, how will translanguaging help them?
Okay, so I think for students that are in advanced levels, translanguaging can help them in various ways. I'm not sure how advanced these students are, but my students, the ones that were in advanced English classes, these students in particularly, I focus a lot of their writing, and I focus on making sure that their writing was structured, was organized. So what I did is that we read articles in Spanish, we also read articles in English, or we read stories in Spanish and English, and then developing those, being able to compare those. Or even asking them to read a story in Spanish and then write about that story in English. It's, like I mentioned, it's a much cognitively demanding test because they're using both languages to accomplish this. So as students are in advanced level, I would recommend doing things like that, having them do one task or the other task in either language.
Carol says that my students' mother tongue is Quechua and their second language is Spanish. Their English level is basic, so what do you suggest? How can she handle the 3 languages in the classroom?
Okay, yeah, well, you have a trilingual student, so that's amazing. I applaud that. That's very good. So what I would do with this is that I would try to find, even using Quechua in the classroom, in the English classroom, what I would suggest you do is to also incorporate that language. And here, I'm guessing you might be from Peru. We focus on just Spanish, but I think it's very, very important for you to also implement Quechua in the classroom and looking for words in Quechua that might be similar in Spanish, or it might have some connection with English, and using the 3 languages. I really suggest that you look for different ways to use the 3. If there are short stories in Quechua, then using those stories. If there are recordings in Quechua, or even asking one student, I want you to do a short presentation in Quechua, and then asking another student to listen to his presentation in Quechua and then write about his presentation in English might be a way. So you're seeing that you are using all the 3 languages in different ways in the classrooms.
Belen wants to know, I think because you mentioned this with writing, she wants to know how this applies to speaking.
To speaking? Okay, so speaking, how this applies to speaking. If, for example, the students have a question and they want to ask you a question, and this question is, and they want to speak in Spanish, then being okay with that. Because I have seen teachers that when the students speak in Spanish, they pretend they don't understand what they're saying. And I think that's a little bit rude as well. The student is speaking to you, you understand what's happening, acknowledging the language that they're speaking about, and that they're speaking in Spanish, and then acknowledging it and responding. Also with oral presentations, you can ask your students to do an oral presentation. For example, if it's an interview, the interviewee can do it in Spanish and the person being interviewed in English. They're using both languages there as well, and etc.
And Elizabeth's question is how this works with adult students, if these ideas also apply to adults.
Yes, of course it applies with adults. I think, you can do the same things that I've talked about, not only with younger students, but also with adults. Yeah, it works with both.
And Roberto has another question on if there would be problems of interference when you're using this approach.
No, I don't think there will be any problems with language interference, and that's I think a misconception that we have about bilingualism, that one language is going to interfere with the other, and that's not true. You know, you are able to distinguish both languages, and the student is not going to get confused. They're not going to have, you know, un revolú en la cabeza. That's not what's going to happen. They're going to be using all of their linguistic repertoire, either Spanish, Quechua, Japanese, Mandarin, whatever other languages, they're using it to learn the content of the classroom. Okay, what I don't want to see is, you know, and what sometimes happens when we're teaching English, you know, you see at your students y, you know, ves una cara, un montón de caritas perdidas, se terminan con unos ojitos que no saben qué está pasando. But that sometimes happens because you're speaking in English and they don't have that proficiency to understand you yet. So using Spanish to help them understand you can be something to be done. Now, you know, I think you have to be very careful of the way that you look at this too, because I'm not saying speaking Spanish only in your classroom and now your class has to be 100% in Spanish. You know, this has to be taken and planned. Okay, you need to plan how you're going to use Spanish. You need to plan how you're going to be using English. You need to plan both. Okay, so it's using it with a purpose. If I'm going to use Spanish, what's the purpose of using Spanish? Maybe it's reading comprehension or writing comprehension or listening comprehension. Listening to a recording in English but answering in Spanish, or vice versa.
And Maribel said, I think some clarification on you're recommending to use 50% English and 50% Spanish. She says when she talks to my kids, they don't understand anything, so I need to use Spanish. Is this the same process with adults? What do you think? So I guess on the percentage and then also the population.
Okay, so on the percentage, I'm not saying that you need to do 50-50%. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that you can plan to use Spanish for some aspects and plan to use English for others, because translanguaging is already happening in your classroom naturally. So that percentage is not something that you are going to say, okay, today I'm only going to speak 50% in Spanish, or because that can't be planned. What you can plan is the task and how these languages are going to be used.
All right. I think you answered all of the questions.
Okay, well, I'm really hoping you all send me an email. I know this is something that happens in your classroom a lot, and I'm really looking forward to hearing about this, about your experiences using both languages, and I would love to keep, you know, in contact with all of you, even if you just want to share your story. I would love to hear it and have more communication with all of you. And I really want to thank you for attending this webinar.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. All right. So that's all we have for this July broadcast of RELO Andy's webinars. So we thank Vanessa for the topic. I want to thank everyone for 2 great years of RELO Andy's webinars. This is my last webinar as a fellow, as my fellowship is coming to an end. So the picture you have here is from the very first RELO Andy's webinar that we did back 2 years ago. So thank you to Marcella and Ricardo, who you see there. They've been helping me with all these webinars since, part of the RELO Andy's team, and Micah as well, who is not in the picture, and Alfredo and Juliana has also helped out with webinars. So thank you to everyone for joining the webinars and for everyone who's helped with the production. We will be back with another one in August, so if you'd like more information on the webinars, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter. You can also email us at reloandys@state.gov for more information, but if you follow us on social media or stay with us through email, we can get the information to you on when the next webinar will be. So be sure to stay in touch. So thank you all again for joining us, and we will see you next month. Bye.